and welcome to Collected Works Bookstore. Welcome to Santa Fe. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, welcome to Zoom. And as always, my thanks to my colleague, Steve Lipworth, who runs our events effortlessly on the outside, but with an enormous amount of preparation beforehand and on the inside. It is wonderful again to have a packed room here at Collected Works. I think my mic just went out. So I will simply use my lungs. Lovely to have you all here. Thank you for joining us. And we especially want to welcome on Zoom the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations and World Affairs Councils. We hope that when any of our guests on Zoom visit Santa Fe, that you will make Collected Works Bookstore a stop on your itinerary. It would be a delight to have each and every one of you come to our fair city and come to what we think is a very lovely bookstore. And I'm going to ask Noah to go to the back and turn off the music, please. Thank you very much. Joe knows how to do that. It is a treat, as always, to have Jim Falk work with us and Santa Fe Global to be a part of the partnership, which he established about 2 years ago with Collected Works and has been a growing and important part of our literary presentations to Collected Works and to the world. Jim is not only the program chairman of Global Santa Fe, he has a colleague here with a table of literature. So if you don't know about Global Santa Fe, look it up online or do come and visit their table here. Our author, who Jim will be introducing at greater length, will be signing here after the program and after the Q&A. And I understand that Cecile, who doesn't have enough on her plate already, is going to be running a slideshow for us at the end of the presentation. Jim Falk is one of the great additions to not only Collected Works, but to the community of Santa Fe at large. He and his wife are making tremendous contributions to their recently adopted city. Jim is the co-host of Perspectives Matter, which is aired every Sunday at 11:30 Central Time on KERA, Dallas, Texas. Welcome, Jim. Welcome, Dr. Hecker, and thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see so many people here, especially with a bit of snow. As Dorothy mentioned, Terrell and I recently moved here, and it's such a delight to wake up and see the snow. So we have a very important and timely topic. I'm holding in my hand an article that was in the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago. North Korea accuses the US of raising tensions. So I'm sure we'll talk about that. And we certainly have someone in this audience knows very well who Dr. Hecker is, but I'm going to do a little bit longer introduction because I know we have friends from across World Affairs Councils in the country, and I want to be sure they know just how fortunate we are to have you in our community. And we're going to be talking about how did one of the poorest, most isolated countries, you know its nickname, the Hermit Kingdom, how did it manage in really less than 30 years to go from 0 nuclear weapons to what some people think may be as much as 50? And just yesterday, in the capital of North Korea, there was a parade held at night. And in that parade were a dozen or so intercontinental ballistic missiles that some people feel confident that soon could reach the mainland of the United States. In fact, the senior fellow at the Carnegie Institute, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace said that North Korea is a third nuclear deterrence relationship for the United States. Obviously, Russia and China being the other two. So let me tell you about Dr. Hecker. He is the Director Emeritus of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. For those of you who are not in Santa Fe, that's about 35, 40 miles away from where we are today. He joined the lab as a graduate research assistant, and he held a number of positions after that, including serving as its director from 1986 to 1997. He is today the professor emeritus at Stanford University, where he taught formerly in the Department of Management Services and Engineering. And he's proud to say for you Aggies out there that he's a professor of practice in the nuclear engineering department at Texas A&M University, College Station. And he also holds a professorship at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. This book, Hinge Points, is the second book following the first one, which was published in 2016, Doomed to Cooperate, which focused on post-Soviet Russian-American nuclear cooperation. He earned all of his academic degrees, bachelor's, master's, and doctorate at Case Western Reserve University. I'm not going to go over all of his awards, but let me just highlight a few. He received the Eugene Grant Undergraduate Teaching Award at Stanford, and most notably, the Presidential Enrico Fermi Award and the American Nuclear Society Seaborg Award. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and this is very interesting, and I hope we can talk about it. He's a foreign member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So warm welcome. So one of the things that people may not know is what is track 2 diplomacy, and especially for North Korea, track 1.5 diplomacy. So track 2.
Oh,
Which of course I would
his
say-
mic's not on?
I don't. You should see a green
Very
one.
good. I
There we
can
go.
put on. Track 2 diplomacy is non-governmental, non-official. So it's an unofficial, non-governmental diplomacy. In essence, people like academics or from various think tanks go and interact with their colleagues and counterparts in the other country. So it's the thing, those are the things that you do aside from the straight government to government discussions and diplomacy. Track 1.5 is when you get to countries like North Korea, there is no unofficial, non-government. So, everybody is associated with the government, otherwise they're not going to let you see them. And so in essence, that's what I was doing with North Korea. So I went there as part of an unofficial, non-governmental venture, actually from my good colleague at Stanford University, John Lewis. So he's the guy who took me to North Korea. He'd been to North Korea a number of times. He actually helped to start the ping pong diplomacy with China. That's what Henry Kissinger gets credit for. But my colleague John Lewis was actually the guy that helped to set that up. And so it's a way to establish a dialogue, often when the governments aren't speaking to each other.
So when was your first trip?
So the first trip to North Korea was in 2004. So at that time, I was still up here in Los Alamos. So I was no longer director, I was senior fellow in Los Alamos. And my colleague John Lewis asked me in late 2003, Sig, I need you to come to North Korea. I said, I don't want to. I could just imagine telling my wife that I'm going to go to North Korea. She was used to me going to Russia and to China and places like that, but North Korea was not on my list, but I went.
So I'm surprised or even a little puzzled. What was the reaction of the U.S. government?
So, well, it was very interesting. I was still an employee of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. But for those of you who know anything about the lab, it was run by the University of California. So I was actually not a government employee, but certainly had government clearances and had to get government permission. And so one of the reasons I told John, he was a very persistent guy, and when he wanted me to go, I finally said yes, because I was sure the American government would say, no way are you gonna go to North Korea. Well, it turns out I was almost right, in that this was during Bush administration time. In the National Security Council, there were people who were pretty conservative folks. And they pretty much said, what the hell is Hecker doing going, want to go to North Korea? So they were very much against it. And in fact, they made sure that I would not be briefed by the CIA before I went. However, there was one person in the Department of Energy and one in the State Department in the Intel Bureau that said, for heaven's sakes, of course we should let him go. We'd learn something. And so with their approval, I was able to go. But my out was still that I thought the North Koreans would never let the former director of Los Alamos in.
So, we know so little about it, and as I said when we started, that it's known as the Hermit Kingdom. What surprised you the most about North Korea when you arrived? And do you feel that you really saw sort of the true community?
Well, what surprised me the most, it's not the Hermit Kingdom. I went there and I met with ambassadors from most of Europe, from England, from Poland, from all these other places. The North Koreans had diplomatic relations with like 145 countries around the world. Not with us, the United States, but they had diplomatic relations with all of them. They were all over the world. They had their embassies all over the world. So they actually knew a lot about the whole world. They actually knew a lot about that world. They knew more about us than we knew about them. But the other sort of immediate surprise was when we got there, to get to North Korea, you have to go through China. So we flew to China, and then from China we flew Air Koryo, old Ilyushin 62 airplane of the Russian style, and we went in.
That made your wife nervous.
And we made it, I should say. But what was so interesting, when we got to North Korea, they took us to the hotel, the so-called Potongan Hotel. We went there, they gave me a room. It was a suite. It was like old Soviet style. The old Soviet style hotels, you'd go in there, you'd be by yourself, you'd have like a 5-room place, and it was a lot like that. Then we went down for dinner, and what surprised me is there were Christmas, this was January 4th, 2004. There were Christmas decorations all over. There were poinsettias, there were reindeers, there were stencils on the windows of Christmas decorations. And I said, in the Hermit Kingdom, that doesn't quite feel right. The next surprise is actually, they told me, if you go out and when you see children, they'll never look at you. They're only going to look at their feet. They'll never look at you. And so I went out. That's what I do every place where I've traveled. And then when I go out for a run. So I went out in a park close to the hotel, and there were these kids sort of crossing across one of the rivers, and they just smile at me, just like that. And I said, this isn't what I expected. So from all of those things were very different. And of course, my dialogue with the diplomats and visit nuclear facilities, that's what I was expecting. But these other things were really interesting. Oh, you said that I meet the real people in North Korea? For the most part, not the general public. They pretty much make sure that you don't interact with the general public. So everything there is set up to meet with the people they want you to meet with. Every now and then, once we went out to sort of a private restaurant, that was a little different. But for the most part, unlike Russia, China, the other places, I did not go to anybody's home, and I would say I did not meet the.
Still on a fairly tight string, I guess.
Absolutely. So my minders, as we call them,
Right.
But the minders were hilarious also at times. Again, that was one of the surprises.
So as we get more now into the book, what is North Korea's dual track diplomacy, which I think you would suggest that we really have not understood?
Right, so that's what I try to explain in the book. And when we get to the hinge points, I can explain where some of the things went wrong. And to explain the dual track approach from their standpoint, you have to understand that the American government, particularly, going back the last 20 years or so, the American government has believed that all the North Koreans do is to cheat and lie. They're really not interested in diplomacy. They're not interested in dealing with you appropriately. So what they want to do, diplomacy is only a path to get to the point where they can build more nuclear weapons. And so they never believe that the North Koreans are really serious about this. And so when the various agreements were actually signed, then there are people in the American government will say that they never lived up to any of those agreements. So the way I came up with the concept of the dual track diplomacy, as I mentioned, I went over as track 1.5 with people like John Lewis and then eventually others who were very knowledgeable on the diplomatic side about North Korea. Most of them having served in the US government at one time or another, some of them having served previously in the CIA, for example. So they knew quite a bit about North Korea. So I had a good education on the political angles of North Korea. And what I brought myself was the knowledge of the technical nuclear world. As you mentioned, I came to Los Alamos as a summer student. Well, it turns out that was 1965. A few days after Nina and I were married, actually, in Cleveland, Ohio. We came out here to New Mexico. I was up at Los Alamos, and within a couple of weeks, I was working with plutonium as a summer student with knowledgeable senior mentors. And so I knew something about plutonium. And of course, I've been in the nuclear business, these whole 50 plus years. So I understood the nuclear world, they understood the political world. And so during my 7 visits, which I had all together, starting 2004 to 2010 every year, what I tried to do is to integrate those two, the political world and the technical world. So one try to inform the other. And so whereas the political people were typically just tracking whatever their path was, whatever the North Koreans were lying and cheating, or it turns out the Americans didn't hold their end of the bargain for most of these agreements either. What I did was to say, all right, how does that match with technically, what they're actually doing? And that's when I came up with this concept to say, no, the North Koreans were actually serious about diplomacy. And it turns out it goes all the way back to the end of the Cold War, because the North Koreans were aligned with the Soviets and the Chinese. Of course, the South Koreans were aligned with us, the United States. And the North Korean world fell apart at the end of the Cold War. The Russians basically deserted them, and the Chinese recognized South Korea. And so Kim Il-sung, who was the grandfather in this dynasty of 3 Kims, actually made the decision to say, perhaps the Americans are a better deal for us than the Chinese or the Russians. And so he wanted to explore diplomacy seriously. Can we actually deal with the Americans, get out of the shadow of China, and that might be the way to go.
So what year was this?
And so this was 1990, 91, right as Soviet Union.
Now, one of the things that surprised me is I didn't realize that North Korea had been a party to the non-proliferation agreement. So when you look at North Korea, and they, as you said, they were trying to align themselves with the United States, why did they withdraw from the agreement and commit themselves to building nuclear weapons?
It's all in here. It's a good team. Yeah, that's a big question. Let me actually just go back for a second. I'll come back to that, and you can guide me back to make sure that I really answer that. But when Kim Il-sung, for whatever his reasons were, decided to seek accommodation or seek normalization with the United States, that put him on a serious track to working with the Americans to see if he can get there. But the North Koreans are as paranoid as can be. And by that time, by 1990, they were as weak as they can be. Until into the 70s, they were economically as good as the South Koreans. And then in the 80s, the South Koreans took off and the North Koreans went down. And so they were weak. So they wanted to do diplomacy, but they wanted to do it from a position of strength. And that's where the nuclear weapons part comes in. And so for a couple of decades, they had sort of built and put together the building blocks with which they could pursue nuclear weapons. And then in 1991, sort of they geared that up a bit. But they were serious, but they pursued those two tracks. Let's talk to the Americans, see if we can actually get there. But we can't really trust them, and we're a little weak country. And so we're going to do this nuclear business also, and we'll do them together. And whether one or the other is on top depends on sort of what the Americans do, what the Chinese do, what happens domestically. And so what I try to explain in the book is they pursued those two, never gave up either one. And then it went back and forth in that way. So they decided to pursue nuclear weapons because economically they were no match for South Korea. Militarily, they were no match for the combination of South Korea and the United States and NATO, because the US military, has been there in South Korea since the end of the Korean War in 1953. At various times, they have many tens of thousands of US troops. Today, there's still 28,500 US troops stationed in North Korea. And there's a UN command, or a UN and South Korea and the US there for this for the unified UN command. And so the North Koreans are no match for that. So what they thought, well, the nuclear weapons sort of offset all of that. And so why don't we put all the pieces in place? And so how they hedged back and forth is the story of the book. And then particularly how they wound up sort of involving me and my colleagues, John Lewis and others, what they showed me, and then how they took this step by step. That's what I tried to lay out.
And those are the hinge points. And tonight, I hope we'll have time to talk about 2 of the hinge points, but not all 6. I think there's 6 that you talk about. So another key factor to North Korea's balance is China. And the United States has often pushed China or hoped China would help with the negotiations with North Korea. But the relationship between China and North Korea has had its ups and downs and is as fragile as any. Could you talk about that? Why does North Korea also view having nuclear weapons important vis-a-vis its relations with China?
Right. So and I'm really not an expert on the ancient history of Northeast Asia, but certainly I've read enough and again dealt enough with my colleagues. And then I've talked to the South and the North Koreans a lot, and also to the Chinese. But essentially, the Koreans, and they are one people, have no use for the Chinese, and they have no use for the Japanese. They have no use for the Chinese because for a century, the Chinese has at times walked all over them. They have no use for the Japanese because similarly in the old days, the Japanese would attack them, and then the Japanese from 1910 to 1945 actually occupied the Korean peninsula, okay? So the Koreans on that little peninsula have viewed themselves, so they call themselves the shrimp between 2 whales. So they have these 2 big countries, and they don't actually like either one of them. And so the only reason they dealt with the Chinese, because at least they provided some help, they provided some protection for them, but that's really not where they wanted to go. So the US, on the other hand, particularly starting in in the Bush administration, not so much in the Clinton administration, because in the Clinton administration, we haven't gotten there yet, but we will when we get to a Hinge Point. Clinton actually, after this, Kim Il-sung decided he wanted to look to the Americans. He did, and they signed an agreement. Actually, it's called an agreed framework, and not a real formal agreement. It's a framework to get the peace. So the Clinton administration actually did that. They took it into their own hands to work with the North Koreans. They didn't really deal with the Chinese. When the Bush administration came in, sort of all things went to pots, which I can explain as far as the Hinge Point goes.
And that's going to be a hinge point I want to talk about.
That's a hinge. However, there then, when things didn't work out for the Bush administration, because they just made such an incredible blunder, and then they said, oh my God, So then they said, the Chinese got to fix these problems. So it was the Bush administration that said, look, you're the Chinese. I mean, you're the guys that are sponsoring these little guys here. You tell them to cut this out. They shouldn't build nuclear weapons. Well, first of all, the North Koreans, didn't know it to go down. And so
So the Chinese do not have that leverage. Where did the North Koreans get their nuclear weapons? Did they build it indigenously? Just a few days ago, the former president of Pakistan, Musharraf, passed away. And there's always been speculation, or Musharraf even admitted that Khan, was it A.Q. Khan, had been advising the North Koreans or had sold them some technology. So tell us more about how North Korea has been able to obtain the technology that they have.
So for the most part, nobody gave the North Koreans nuclear weapons. First of all, nobody gave them nuclear weapons. Nobody directly gave them nuclear weapons technology. And so they built them themselves. And for the most part, they should get credit or don't be punished for the fact that they were able to build these nuclear weapons themselves. However, they've been clever the entire time. And so the whole history, and I'll try to condense it as much as possible, is it started with the Soviets helping the North Koreans to develop a civilian nuclear energy program. In other words, nuclear energy, nuclear electricity, and nuclear medicine. And that was part of actually the guy who started this sort of getting civilian nuclear capabilities around the world to countries that would swear not to build nuclear weapons, that then became eventually the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The guy who did that was President Eisenhower in 1953. And so that started the Atoms for Peace program. That's what Eisenhower started. The Soviets they thought it was an American ploy. But then it took them a year or so. Then they called it the peaceful atom instead of Atoms for Peace. So they did that. So during that time period, now we're talking about 1964, 5, 6, and so forth, we built a reactor for, guess who? Iran. Okay. So the first reactor that went into Iran and that taught Iranian scientists at MIT and Stanford and other places was part of Atoms for Peace, because the Shah was our friend in Iran. Well, the Soviets did exactly the same thing in North Korea. So they built the first little reactor for the North Koreans. The North Koreans went to school in Moscow and went to the Duma Scientific Center, just like the Iranians came here. So again, in this long-winded fashion, the very beginning of that all came with just sort of Atoms for Peace and in that direction. And then the North Koreans, Kim Il-sung, the grandfather, somewhere in the 1980s timeframe, decided that he needed the second path, and that is a nuclear weapons capability. And so he started putting things in place. And the part that were then more weapons oriented rather than civilian nuclear oriented, he didn't talk about. They built those clandestinely in North Korea, but they built them themselves. And so for the most part, and they built them, and they were incredible students of what was going on around the world. And they took advantage of a leaky export control system around the world. One of those guys was A.Q. Khan in Pakistan, who sold nuclear technologies wherever he could. He sold it to Iraq, he sold it to Iran, he sold it to Libya, he sold some to North Korea. But it turns out for North Korea, he was a latecomer. And so he was not the reason North Korea had their weapons. They
were already far along.
They were already, there are two paths to nuclear weapons. You can build a reactor and make plutonium, or you can take uranium out of the ground and sort of process it and enrich it and make a uranium bomb. So you can go either way. The plutonium bomb, they were already on their own. They had developed that capability to make plutonium. The uranium they had also been working on that, and that's where A.Q. Khan helped them along the way.
So let me ask you this, from your observations, is North Korea an exporter of this technology? Do you feel comfortable that it's secure?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Of course, it's also very, very important question. So today, I feel quite confident that North Korea is not exporting any nuclear technologies, or certainly not selling nuclear weapons, selling plutonium, or selling highly enriched uranium today. Have they done so in the past? The answer is yes. And along the way, North Korea essentially would sell anything that's not nailed down that they could make some money with. Today, one of the reasons they don't do so much of that today is because there are much easier ways to make money than to try to circumvent the export control system, and it's called cybercrime. And so they're really big into hacking and being able to make money in that route. However, what they did, and there were a couple of really egregious examples of the North Koreans stepping out. One of them is they sold some uranium enrichment materials, materials that were key to be able to enrich uranium to make a bomb, and they sold those to Libya, to Gaddafi. And this was in the early 2000s. And then the second one was just, it was incredible that they had the guts to do this. But they went and helped the Syrians build a nuclear reactor in Syria. And that one escaped the US intel communities for quite a while. And even more amazingly, it escaped the Israel intelligence community, Mossad. They didn't find out. So that project started, the best we can put it back to get together today, around 2001. The current.
I'm going to interrupt you because that's a good story in the book, and I want to be sure we have enough time, if that's okay.
So let me just say,
Yep.
that story is in the book.
Yep.
And then I had an involvement in an interesting fashion, and you'll have to read the book. And also, I have a reference in here to one of the most fascinating books. And Dorothy, you have to make sure that you have that. It's called Shadow Strike. By an Israeli journalist, and he tells the story of how eventually the North Koreans went and built a reactor, the Israelis bombed the reactor.
Don't give it away. Dorothy put this in the social media. When I read your book a few weeks ago, I planned, which I often do, to say, okay, I'm going to read 100 pages of this very serious book and then watch UVA basketball. But instead, I could not get off the sofa because there's so many stories like this, especially when we get to the Hanoi summit, which we're going to talk about. So Kim Jong-un, I have this perception of him when they did the horrible movie Sony did, which I'm sure they wish they hadn't done, called The Interview. You remember there was a movie, and then the North Koreans came in and hacked Sony, and it was a disaster and cost Sony millions of dollars. But Kim Jong-un is not the caricature that we think about, is he?
Well, of course, initially the answer is we didn't know.
Okay.
I mean, we really knew nothing. We didn't even know how old the guy is. Even though during his youth, he was in Switzerland at a boarding school for some time. But very, very little was known about Kim. And one of the good things when we get to Trump summits.
And we will.
Okay. Well, the bad thing is when Trump became president in 2017, that was the most dangerous year in terms of North Korea, because in his own way, fire and fury, saying that he had no choice but to destroy, all of North Korea, and all of that. It looked dangerous, but what was really dangerous, that will get me to answer your question about Kim Jong-un, is we didn't know anything about Kim Jong-un. I mean, we knew nothing. The only guy who knew anything is not a guy you really like to write home about. That's Dennis Rodman. So Rodman was in North Korea. He met Kim Jong-un. Of course, he came back. He said, "Oh, he's a great guy."
So let me ask you something, because you said about how many countries have diplomatic relations with North Korea, and they have a presence there. So why isn't there more known about him?
Yeah, so by the time Kim Jong-un came on, that was very low key for a long time.
Okay.
Unlike with the grandfather, with the father, where there was a lot of interaction, Kim Jong-un kept a pretty low profile. I mean, aside from executing his uncle and poisoning his stepbrother and so forth. So we knew those things. Then we knew nothing else about the guy. And now he's got a nuclear button. Then of course, he told Trump, he said, you better watch it. The nuclear button is always on my desk. And of course, Trump said, well, my nuclear button is bigger than yours. And mine works. Now you can imagine people know something about nuclear. That makes you pretty nervous. So we know nothing about Kim Jong-un, and we know, let's say next to nothing. We know absolutely nothing about the military that controls what they call the strategic rocket forces. And so now you've got these guys, and I'm the guy who's watching them build up their nuclear arsenal. And so that's what I've done since I haven't been there. But since I was there, I've seen the facilities, I talked to the people. Then I've been able to put together a pretty sensible way of how that arsenal has actually increased. And by the time that Kim Jong-un was there in 2017, I mean, he had nuclear weapons that could reach all of South Korea and most of Japan. And here those two guys are sparring. Then Trump gets together with him in the first summit at Singapore. They shake hands. They fall in love. All of us laughed at that. But the good news part of that, we started learning something about Kim Jong-un. And we could have learned a lot more if we had a president who paid attention.
Okay, so let's jump ahead and go to that Hinge point, because I want to be sure you have time to tell us what you think about John Bolton.
So, let me just Singapore.
Okay.
So the first summit, and again, I have this all. It's not just because it's my book, but you have to read the book. She's a salesman too. You have to read the book, not only for the details of what we're just discussing now, but actually the really important part are my 7 visits and the discussions. And it turns out I took good notes, and my colleague John Lewis took even better notes. And so we have dialogue in here that what I tried to do is sort of put you in the room with us as we're discussing this. Put you in the room when I wound up holding the North Korean plutonium in my hands in a glass jar, sealed. So you have to read the book to really get the sense of that. And you have to read the book to understand John Bolton's influence. So the way John Bolton, so first of all, one of the hinge points, the first one was when Bush came into office and Bolton then was there in the Bush administration, when they walked away from the Clinton agreed framework. I'll just say only that much. But let me also say that President Obama, even though he said, I'm gonna reach out my hand if you unclench your fist, he just, the policies in North Korea were just terrible. He also didn't get this, so he had his hinge points. And then comes Trump, 2017 disaster. And lo and behold, between Kim Jong-un and Trump, they turn things around. They go to Singapore, they hold hands, they get the big publicity, and we start learning something about Kim Jong-un. And they actually decide to do the two things that are most crucial. One is the Americans want them to get rid of nuclear weapons. It's called denuclearization. I don't like that word, but so getting rid of the nuclear weapons. And Trump actually also said, and normalization. That's what the North Koreans wanted in the 90s. That's what they wanted in 2000, 2010. And then here in 2000, they wanted normalization. And Trump says, you'll have it. When they normalize. All right, so now between June of 2018 and February of 2019, a summit, the second summit at Hanoi, the diplomatic corps were supposed to go ahead and put some meat on this joint statement. And there, both sides really failed. So let me just say the North Korean side failed because Kim Jong-un now had a direct pipeline to Trump. And not only through the summits, but they exchanged these letters. And
Which happened to stay at Mar-a-Lago perhaps longer than they should have.
right. And I also thought love letters. And besides, I wasn't quite sure Trump could actually write, so I was worried about whether he's going to read this and depending how long the letters are. It turns out eventually one of my colleagues that worked with me in North Korea was able to see all those letters. And the letters were incredible, particularly from Kim Jong-un.
We have about 5 more minutes before we're going to open it up. So what I'd like you to address, if you would, is how close President Trump and Kim Jong-un were to perhaps reaching some type of agreement, but how external factors that played on Trump, that it was the time when Michael Cohen was testifying, and also how Kim Jong-un was feeling pressure from his whole back or his diplomats. And so just
Okay,
cut to the chase there.
I'll try to be brief on this one. So they go to Hanoi. Kim Jong-un didn't let his diplomats do anything. He was going to settle it all with Trump right then and there. Trump went to Hanoi initially here to get a big deal with Kim Jong-un. However, and even though I hate to plug his book, but John Bolton, the book that's called The Room Where It Happened, just essentially brags about how he indeed coached Trump that the best thing for him to do is to walk away for him personally. And then the Michael Cohen hearing actually happened during the Hanoi. So Trump looked all that, and even though Trump wanted to make a deal with Kim Jong-un, he decided to walk away. And that was a hinge point because what Kim Jong-un actually offered up would have given us an opportunity to find out if they're actually going to get rid of their nuclear weapons. We don't know if he would have, and it depended on lots of things, but we didn't go far enough to find out. And so that was a big hinge point. And then just to jump to today, we have the aftermath of today. So today, the big issue is actually one where I told you they were always interested in serious diplomacy. It doesn't look like it anymore.
Dr. Hecker, I want to take advantage that you're being here to talk about something that happened just last month. And that's when the president of South Korea hinted to the possibility that South Korea would build its own nuclear weapons or ask the United States to redeploy. He wrote a great article that the disastrous downsides of South Korea building nuclear weapons. Tell us why you feel so strongly about that.
Right. So first of all, I'm guided by the fact that the fewer fingers on the nuclear trigger in the world, the better off we are. So essentially, you want the proliferation of nuclear weapons, even though some people say, well, why not? It's kept us safe. The more fingers on that nuclear trigger, the worse off it is, because you never know as to how one reacts, how things escalate. And the worst place you want people who, with fingers on the nuclear trigger on each side, is across the demilitarized zone in Korea. They constantly have provocations back and forth, and you've got still a reasonably inexperienced leader on the north side, with his finger on the trigger, and you got a completely inexperienced leader on the south side. And the last thing the United States government wants those guys to have is nuclear weapons. I mean, for heaven's sakes, that is about the most dangerous place. So what that means, the US government is going to do everything it can to say, you South Korean government, you cannot have nuclear weapons. That would mean, pulling our troops out. Of course, they'd have to withdraw from the non-proliferation treaty. And they'd wind up giving, just think, they're going to trade Samsung, LG, Kias and Hyundais for bombs. And what the world are the bombs going to do for them? We're there. We work with it.
But why does 71% of the South Korean population support the nuclearization of South Korea?
Because they don't understand what they'd have to give up to get the nuclear weapons. And I wrote that article primarily for the South Korean public. And I think in the end, the way it's evolved, for the most part, the president has walked that back several times. For the most part, he was sort of trying to light a fire under the Americans, to show, hey, look, you really are our ally and we're going to come to your rescue and all of that. But even all that talk, it's not the right talk. We need South Korea as our ally, and they're sitting there in Northeast Asia. We got to worry about China. We have to worry about the entire world. They're there as our allies. The Japanese are there as our allies. Trump treated it as a protection racket. That's why the South Korean public is concerned to a large extent. Trump said, let's walk away. Why in the world? They got to pay us more for that. If we're going to do that, let them pay us more. That's exactly the wrong sort of the ideology is, hey, look, you're our allies. We're allies together.
I know we have, I hope, questions here and also with our Zoom audience. And when you ask a question here, please wait for the microphone so that we can be sure that we record it. And before I open it up, on a scale from 1 to 10, how concerned are you today about North Korea being a flashpoint? 10 being the worst.
7.
Why?
Because if you watch what the North Koreans not only have done in terms of, last year they launched more, these are all test launches, of course, more missiles than in the previous few years combined, the most ever. Just yesterday, they had the military parade. They showed some more ICBMs. By the way, I do not think the North Koreans yet can have confidence in reaching the United States with the missile and a warhead inside the missile. So I'm not worried about getting nuked right now from the North Koreans. They're walking towards that capability. However, those sort of clashes between the North and South are there constantly. And the North has clearly gone on a path where they're now saying, perhaps we are really better off with the Russians and the Chinese, even though we can't stand the Chinese after all, but that's the way we may have to go. And so through some sort of miscalculation, misunderstanding, you get some flashpoint which leads you to a hinge point. As here, we're going to have a decision as to what to make. Or for example, if they can come back and do the next nuclear test and the Americans react in some way, that's what you have to make sure that you avoid that. But they are only one of 3 countries that can threaten the US and its allies with nuclear weapons.
Let's hear from you. Raise your hand, please, if you have a question.
I'm going to ask these and then I'll move into the audience
Okay.
here. I think you just answered this. Raymond Chamini asked, how would you evaluate the size and strength of the North Korean nuclear arsenal? But I think you just said that is
Anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, just, so in terms of the size, I mean, in the end, we don't know, but I've put together these estimates. And I think it's possible today that the North Koreans have enough of the bomb fuel, don't even have enriched uranium, for 40 to 60 nuclear weapons. I think they can reach, with a nuclear warhead, all of South Korea and most of Japan. And so that's an enormous danger. I do not yet think that they can reach the United States with an ICBM. They're working in that direction.
Thank you, Ray, for that question. Ray is a member of Global Santa Fe and the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth.
He actually has another
He
question.
would.
Is it possible for the US to facilitate the conclusion of a reconciliation between North and South Korea?
Well, I mean, that's, that's been the assignment, the whole time. My own view is, in the end, the North and South have to reconciliate themselves. And it's really their business. They're one people, of course, they've got a very different reaction. And the US can only play a facilitation role. And its most important role has been first to deal with the enormous North Korean conventional military that it had in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, and now with a nuclear weapon. So the US has to facilitate by sort of neutralizing that and helping to get a nuclear weapons-free Korean peninsula. Then the rest of the work has to be done by the Koreans.
Okay, David Jimenez wants to know about yesterday's parade where Kim Jong-un was seen with his 10-year-old daughter. It's been suggested that Kim Jue could become the future leader of North Korea, succeeding her father. Do you have any thoughts on this?
So I had an email just a few hours ago from my colleague, who I mentioned a lot in his book, Bob Carlin, who really is the North Korea expert in the United States. He said, if you're asked that question tonight, don't answer it. He said, it's just so speculative to try to turn that into who's going to be his successor. So I'm not going to answer it.
Go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to
We'll
ask,
get you in a second, Diana.
I wanted to ask if it's okay, could you please expand upon your, I don't know, anyway, if you could expand upon your great love of John Bolton.
Could you expand on your feelings about John Bolton?
Read the book. I was in the book, actually my lovely wife Nina has read the whole book all the way through. She thought I was too kind to Trump. That's what she, and Bolton, she gave me a little more credit on Bolton. But I don't think I was easy on Bolton. I mean, I clearly, in that first hinge point where he had the first major impact, that was the time when we could have stopped North Korea from building the bomb, is when the Bush administration walked away because AQCOM related to uranium enrichment. They found the North Koreans doing that on the side. And by the way, in the book, again, on the technical side, I say everything that the North Koreans were doing. I mean, I'm not a North Korean sympathizer. I lay it all out there. They were developing uranium enrichment at the time. The Clinton administration knew it. They were waiting, and Bolton came in, and the intel agency had then sort of re-emphasized the fact, hey, North Koreans are really trying to cheat on the uranium enrichment. And in his first book, there he actually said that revelation was the hammer I needed to kill the agreed framework. And so he was determined to kill the Clinton administration deal. There was no way he wanted, and then he had others with him, from Dick Cheney to Don Rumsfeld to many others. And so he was disastrous And he hasn't lived up to that. You know, that decision caused the fact that North Korea built the bomb in 6 months to a year. They tested the bomb a couple of years later. Somebody ought to be held responsible for that. He and his colleagues are. Okay, then he comes back in 2017, 2018, and into 2019, and he coaches Trump to walk away. And there's nothing better but his book that really shows how he takes pride in that. And then I put that in the proper perspective of how disastrous that was.
And it's interesting that he may be running for president. Diane? Is her microphone working?
You know,
It's not.
it's something to do with yours. I don't, no, you can
Okay.
just ask him.
If
you can repeat
had
it.
A very interesting discussion in your book, quoting Hans Morgenthau, where you say there's either strategic narcissism, where we want to see the world the way we think it is, versus strategic empathy, where we really try to figure out what else even besides ourselves. And the Department of Defense calls that to try to avoid the mirroring strategy.
So the question is,
The question is, going forward, since you have given us so many examples where the US policymakers, whichever agencies they are, have just not quite got it. What is your hope for that there will be proper thinking about this going forward to be able to do the best we can in negotiating with the North Koreans?
And so I'm glad that at the very end, you said with the North Koreans, because quite frankly, you could ask your question of how the US government has sort of, in some cases, strategic narcissism, and the other case, strategic empathy. And that's a big question for the whole wide world, obviously. And for North Korea, right now, I'm just afraid it does not look very helpful at all. And in fact, it's interesting that actually, since I wrote that book, and I wrote that particular section, I have a project now out at Monterey that's actually called Strategic Empathy. And it's based on a book that's written by a gentleman by the name of Zachary Shore. And it's called A Sense of Your Enemy. And in essence, he sort of develops how, more or less, I used to say it, in other terms, like you need to walk a mile in their shoes. You really need to understand. And for example, that's what I've tried to do, particularly in Russia, where I've been 57 times. I really learned something about Russia. I learned something about the Russia. I've been to China 39 times. I understand them less than I understand the Russians. But I've always tried to sort of understand their point of view, because in the end, in the nuclear business, and that's what my previous book was, Doomed to Cooperate, that because nuclear has such enormous potential benefits of nuclear electricity, nuclear medicine, because it has such enormous potential downside, you have to cooperate to make sure the good stuff outweighs the bad stuff. You must cooperate. And so that's what you need to do. And so right now, we're doing a strategic empathy project on North Korea, trying to better understand exactly what sort of messages were they sending us along the way. And then how do we get that across to our government? But right now, our government, the Biden administration, it has its hands full, but it didn't start out well with North Korea either. It was sort of the extension of what we saw in the Obama administration, which is called strategic patience. In essence, it's sort of ignoring them.
is there any track 1.5 diplomacy taking place now?
So that's the problem. Right now with North Korea, there's none. There's none. And that's an enormous danger, Because before, at least that was a way, and we had several dozen people in the United States that interacted with the North Koreans, and the North Koreans came here about it. None of that is going on right now.
Other questions? Go ahead. Cecile?
I actually have a question.
Okay.
I don't know if there's anyone else. Oh, sorry.
So given all of that, what should be the US posture toward North Korea, given that North Korea is unlikely to give up its nuclear weapons? What should we be doing to make the best of this horrible situation?
And to be sure we get this on the recording, what should be the United States policy now?
Correct.
Well, I wish I knew. I've, for what it's worth, I've given my advice to all of those administrations, by the way. I didn't care whether they were Republican or Democrat, and at very high levels. From the Bush administration through Obama, through Trump, and now through Biden. So just before the Biden administration actually took over, I sent my recommendations in because I know key people, very close to Senator Biden. Senator Biden is in here. So I actually tell him coming back, and I briefed then Senator Biden and Senator Lugar about the trip to North Korea. That's a fantastic discussion with him. So I sent the recommendations, and that's what we should have done. And essentially what I said is, look, get out early, do something quickly with the North Koreans, and show them that you're willing to take their concerns into considerations, not just focus on the denuclearization part. So do both of those things, get out early, and be ready for a tough slog, but get out early. And the idea would be do this before you do a 6 months, nuclear policy review as far as North Korea. In 6 months' time, lots of things happen. And then I've made some very specific proposals, actually. And to his credit, I was with Secretary Blinken invited me last June, saying, hey, look, things aren't going all that well with North Korea. I want to know what's your ideas. There were 5 of us who came. We laid it out again. Again, my view at that point was still one, we still had a chance. And what I promoted was the call cooperative conversion of the nuclear complex from military to civilian. Don't just go in and say you got to get rid of everything. They can have nuclear electricity, they can have nuclear medicine, but in the process of converting and to do it cooperatively, we're going to be there with you. South Koreans are going to be there with you. During that process, which would take many, many years, you have a chance of walking down the line to actually understanding, what concerns them. So the strategic empathy, that's the part of that. So that's what was done. I've written papers on that. I've talked to Secretary Blinken, I've talked to others in the government, but right now they waited too long. Now my advice has been they don't want to talk, and the North Koreans are not answering the phone from the Bible. They're not answering the phone. But is it any worse than doing 2017 with Trump and fire and fury? I'm not sure whether it's any worse. So what I say, have these things in your pocket and be ready in case they switch, because they switched in 2018. They may switch again for whatever reason.
You get the last question, Cecile.
So last month we had a really interesting a woman here, Dr. Mariah Gomez, who wrote a book called Nuclear Nueva Mexico about the nuclear colonization of New Mexico. And I'm wondering, as we're policing the rest of the world about their nuclear proliferation, how we're deproliferating, I don't know what the word is, but how America is, because we had a madman in the White House in 2017 who was ready to put his finger on the button. And so how do we prevent that, living downwind from the nuclear, the place where the nuclear,
So essentially the question is, should the United States in some way be positioned to denuclearize, especially since we are here in New Mexico? So
and we police the rest of the world to do that.
So first of all, New Mexico has done an enormous service for the United States of America with all of the nuclear things that were born here and done here. And just like I said, nuclear has positive sides, nuclear has negative sides. And of course, there are negative sides associated with it. In my opinion, actually, the most negative sides of what happened in New Mexico is the uranium mining, out towards the west. But in the end, one has to learn how to manage all of those things. So as far as nuclear weapons themselves, I'm of course often asked the question, so should we get rid of all nuclear weapons? My answer is the world is not ready for that. And so I'm not in favor of getting rid of all nuclear weapons. There's a treaty that a large number of countries have passed just a couple of years ago, the treaty to ban nuclear weapons altogether in the world. I'm also not in favor of that treaty at this particular time. So for whatever it is, my sort of philosophy has been, since I've been at Los Alamos since 1965, is you'd like to get to a world that has no nuclear weapons. I don't know how to do that. And so instead, what I spend my energy doing to make sure that this incredible thing that's happened since 1945 is no nuclear weapon has been used in war or in terrorism. No nuclear weapons. If you think about that, if you look back in history, every time new technology was invented, it was used in war in order to kill people better and more. The nuclear weapons have not been used. And that's the thing that I focus on, is what can we do to make sure that nuclear weapons are never used again. And for the time being, whether we like it or not, right now, with Putin and his threats, in Ukraine, how in the world could we give up nuclear weapons? So we should reduce nuclear weapons, take whatever the benefits are, the fact that we haven't annihilated each other, and then eventually get rid of them. Because as I just let me finish this, because that's what I tell my students when we have this discussion, is in the end, you do have to say you got to get rid of them. In other words, if you ask the question, how many nuclear weapons? Well, if you don't want to get rid of them all, how many do you want? How many should there be? Well, should there be 5, 10, 100, 1,000? I mean, how do you choose the number? The only number you can really say is, well, 0. And then the even more difficult question is, if there are some finite number, who gets to keep them? Who gets to, think about that. We have 5, states by the Non-Proliferation Treaty that are allowed to have nuclear weapons, with the understanding that eventually they will get rid of them. But why these 5? Why not North Korea? Why not India, Pakistan? So who gets to keep them? Well, you can't answer. There's no good answer to that. So in the end, there will have to be no nuclear weapons someplace, but I just don't know how to get there.
Well, I always like to end programs on an optimistic note, and I think there was a little bit of optimism there.
So I do want to add one that was mentioned before. So since I've been to North Korea 7 times, they actually allowed me to take lots of photos, including for 2 of the visits, photos inside their Los Alamos. Essentially, I took photos.
We're going to end the recording and then you can tell people about that. So I want to thank everybody with
so we're going to put it on.
Right, for our virtual audience. They won't be able to see it. So to all of you, thanks for watching. Remember, Collected Works, and tune into our next program here. You can always go to the Collected Works website to find out about upcoming programs. And one thing I do want to add about the book, having read it, and I know a few of you have, I ran away from physics and chemistry class. And for the first time, I almost am beginning to understand some of the technology. Not even enough to be dangerous, don't worry about that. But he does explain it. And fortunately, in my view, there's only a few chapters that are really technical. The rest of it is more political and international affairs. To all of you, thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time.
I wasn't sure
if Dorothy mentioned it, but we work on the honor system here. So if you line up and have your book signed and speak with Dr. Hager, you can then get them purchased at the counter at the front, please. Thank you.
And I'll make another plug for Global Santa Fe's program on February 27th. Just go to our website, globalsantafe.org.
I get to stand up so I can sit down.
People are gonna line up now.
Yeah, so what we're gonna do is.